It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID Livestream, Series 20, Episode 3. That's Episode 117 in the aggregate. Start here. We begin with shock news today. Ed Tilly, a parish farewell to the CEO of SIBO for the past decade. It's a rather unfortunate end to an ignominious CEO tenure in CBO's 50th year. How very, very sad indeed to mark his passing out of office on such a basis. All the details are going to be in Exchange Invest Daily tomorrow, the newsletter of the Bourse Business, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure subscribers will be looking forward to the pith on what happened behind the scenes at SIBO. One other thing, we have to give you a huge warning, ladies and gentlemen. That's the pink squeeze. Exchange Invest has been warning subscribers for many weeks now. In 42 days, the world's biggest commodity squeeze of 2023 will take place. Stock up on pink right now or suffer the consequences, as Halloween 2023 is going full Barbiecore. Meanwhile, ArrowAC, there's a Supreme Court showdown for ArrowAC and the Bahamas regulator on October the 13th. ArrowAC appears confident, leaving us to wonder, does that mean our exchange building arm will be receiving its arrears soon? Speaking of interest rates, the consultation of the proposed cessation of the Bloomberg Short-Term Bank Yield Index, BSBY, was an announcement last week from Bloomberg, which got very little publicity indeed. However, it's an epic. Low IOSCO would appear to have killed credit-sensitive interest rates after their summer encyclical against the whole concept of inspiring the idea that there may be a possibility to price interest rates in a credit-sensitive fashion for hedgers. Therefore, BSBY, the Bloomberg US copycat of the original ICE Bank Yield Index, has now been closed because it's apparently uneconomic. Ameribor is the last CSR standing. Can it survive? Indeed, will in the broader, longer-term basis, regulators come to their subjective senses about the whole concept of credit-sensitive rates? Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is Mark Wheatley. The topic we're looking at, from the city to space. What a broad environment, a great canvas for today. The City of London remains the world's most cosmopolitan international financial centre, as we know. With well over 1,000 years of continuous history at the forefront of commerce, it's hardly surprising moves are afoot in the square mile to make the UK's financial hub an epicentre and for investing in the space economy. Today, we are joined by a leading City of London politician and advisor, Mark Wheatley. He will tell us more about his business in a moment. And we're going to be talking about this fascinating, well, diaspora, which is the square mile, and all of the things which radiate all the way out round it, and indeed soon into outer space as well. Mark, welcome to the show. Where in the world are you today?
Hello, Patrick. Right now, I'm sitting in a booth in the City of London, but you'll often find me in southeast London in a leafier place.
In a leafier place? Is that where you live?
Yeah. There's an area called Eltham, which is a bit south of Greenwich, and that's where I am with my family, 2 kids, Czech wife. But, it might sound cheesy, and puns abound when you talk about space, but we live in a house just opposite where Bob Hope was born, butting on to something called the Progress Estate, which is one of these early 20th century initiatives, social housing. And I think being caught between hope and progress is a good metaphor for the City of London in many ways, and for our activities in space. So very happy to be usually caught between hope and progress.
Fascinating altogether. Of course, Bob Hope being one of those other great British inventions that was exported to the United States with great success. I suppose the other one we could mention would be, as it does happen to impact on the topic of space, would be Sir Frank Whittle's invention of the original jet engine, which was propelled to the Americans in an interesting deal in the middle of the Second World War, and therefore allowed that degree of propulsion to take place alongside, of course, Werner von Braun and his rocket program, which was so important to putting a man on the moon. So tell me, Mark, how did you get involved in the City of London originally?
Well, essentially, I mean, my background is my mother was South American. She was an anarchist. My father was a British Tory, and I was born and brought up in Africa. And, you know, at a time of apartheid, there was a lot of politics talked about in our family. We were in Botswana, across the border. So I grew up in a kind of a politicized family, but I wanted to go into business when I graduated. So 2 years in banking with Midland, which was then a takeover target for HSBC. But I had a really lovely 6 months working in a think tank. And that think tank was looking at the creation of First Direct, touchscreen technology where I was, and contactless payment, which went on to Oyster. And that 6 months really inspired me to do something other than banking. So at the end of my 2-year training, I resigned from the bank and became a headhunter. The idea was I was going to headhunt just for a few months, move friends of mine who were lawyers in Scotland from the firm they trained with to a new employer, say Dundas and Wilson to Shepherd and Wedderburn. But I found I quite liked recruitment, did that for a few years, came down to London, joined a small management consultancy, and that picks up on my time with Midland. I was really interested in what they were doing with technology, and then spent most of my career with them. They moved into the city of London in about 2000. It was around that time that I also got a vote in the city. So, yeah, I don't know how much your audience is familiar with the franchise in the City of London.
I think that's a perfect place to go on, because, yes, the City of London, with the exception of the Vatican City, I think has the most restrictive franchise of a city on earth.
Exactly. Well, I mean, you can talk about, when we talk about the City of London, we can mean a whole range of things. Some people think of Greater London, but what I mean very specifically in political terms is the square mile right at the heart of the rest of London. And as you'll be aware, that's the Roman London. So originally fortified, it prospered for several hundred years under the Romans. When they left, it fell into rack and ruin. And then it was refounded by King Alfred in, I guess, the 8th century. And from there, it really prospered. It's worth bearing in mind that the City of London was at the intersection of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So if someone left their lord's manor, someone who was an indentured servant or otherwise tied to the land, and they spent a year and a day in London, they became free. And of course, that was at that time a wonderful opportunity for them to get on with their lives and to prosper. And around that time, London was governed in several ways. Of course, it had parishes, and they gave a local place, but we had guilds, which have now become livery companies, and they regulated trade in their areas. So the fishmongers made sure that fish sold in London was clean and good, and they also looked after the members of their companies. So over time, those guilds became significant for the city in trading terms. That right for people to be free in the city meant that really, I suppose, security of property and life gave them some sense of confidence to build their lives here. And really, London prospered over several hundred years. And then it really took off with the agricultural and the industrial revolution and essentially the British Empire. So, I mean, London is one of the great financial centers of the world. But the beating heart of it is that square mile where I am now.
And I think, I mean, the great story I always love about the city, which I think I've repeated previously on this show, was when we were coming towards 2000 AD, the then management of the Life Exchange, London International Financial Futures Exchange, now part of Intercontinental Exchange, they were discussing what they were going to do on the 31st of December 1999. And there was an epic moment where their head of regulation and policy said, well, shouldn't we call the Corporation of London, the corporation being the body, essentially the city council that works with you, the councillors of the city. And they said, shouldn't we call the corporation, just see if they're planning anything? And this magnificent conversation ensued, of which the highlights were the man from the corporation says, I don't believe we have anything planned at the moment, but let me ask around. Why don't you call me next week? And I'll tell you if we do have any plans. And in fact, while I'm at it, I'll go and have a look in the archives and see what we did last time.
Yeah.
Which I think is that's my favorite City of London story for everyone who tells me that the City of London's suddenly going to disappear as a financial centre when you've got well over 1,000 years of continuous history. What the sheriffs, I mean, actually date back to 750 or something AD. I mean, quite incredible. So just fill us in. What is, actually, first of all, let me just stop and say, Good evening to Grimsby. Hello, Marcus Ward. It's lovely to see you. Thank you very, very much for joining the show. I hope you've been having a great summer all round. And at the same time, hello, John T. Good evening, all. Glad to be able to join you. We're delighted to see you on the show. Thank you very, very much. And if you've got a question for Mark, or if anybody would like to make a remark, please do so. And don't forget as well, we really, really would appreciate a little symbol of love. If you have a chance, give us one of those heart-shaped thumbs up, because it helps the AI bots realize how exciting it is to see what's going on in this show and push us up the YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn rankings. Now, at the same time, explain to us who is eligible for a vote in the City of London, because it's not a universal franchise.
No, it's an odd body. So, I mean, essentially, you've got a square mile, which is why we call it the square mile, of course. Within that, there are about 8,000 residents and about 500,000 workers coming to this community to work every day. So we have a special position, and that means that every resident gets a vote. There are 25 wards, so those residents are split roughly between the Barbican and the east of the city, but there are residents in pretty much every ward, I'm sure. So there are 25 wards with that number of residents, about 8,000. And the 500,000 workers are recognized with what's called an employment vote. So broadly speaking, an employer can get one vote for every 5 members of staff that they have if they're located in the city. So yeah, our worker base gives that sort of contribution. We've got about 500 voters in the ward that I represent, and most of them are in places like Namura, Man Group. There are some lawyers, there are some charity professionals, and some people connected to the livery as well. But only 17 residents, I think.
It's quite incredible. And also, actually, if I remember correctly, I mean, the wards, ward by ward, some of the wards have got minuscule numbers of voters. I mean, really only 100 or less or something, I think, in one of the wards.
Yeah, and some are much greater, of course. So some of the big wards have thousands, but mine is probably a mid-sized ward. We've got, there are 25 aldermen, so the city has 1 alderman per ward, and it's from the alderman that the Lord Mayor is drawn. And then we have 100 common councilmen. So obviously it's an average of 4 per ward, but some like mine are small with 2 in terms of our elected members, and some are larger with 8. But yeah, the number of members we have doesn't necessarily reflect the electoral base perfectly.
Yeah, and I mean the Lord Mayor. Now you hit on an interesting one, because then very quickly, we have had actually the sheriff Michael Manelli, when he was sheriff a couple of years back, was on the show, and I mean that's an interesting process, because then you have the councilman, you have the alderman, who are the sort of the senior statesmen of each ward, as it were, and then they choose the Lord Mayor, and there's also this process of choosing a sheriff, or 2 sheriffs as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think you're pretty much there, but I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. The Lord Mayor is, formally speaking, an alderman who has been sheriff, who is then elected by members of the livery companies. So, I touched on those guilds that became livery companies. There are about 110 of them, and they range from the Mercers, the Drapers, which I belong to, right the way through to I suppose they're not yet livery, but the Guild of HR Professionals. So if you have an occupation which has a city locus, you can apply to have a guild, and there are formalities and complexities, but you have to basically go through various stages, including charitable donation activity, and you can become a livery company. And with that, you get the right to contribute to the election of the Lord Mayor. But the candidates for Lord Mayor are nominated by the Aldermanic Court, the other 25 aldermen. So absolutely, essentially, unless the Aldermanic Court nominates, then a candidate won't go to the livery companies.
Yes, what a fascinating and rather arcane issue it is. And of course, then next week, at the end of next week, we have the fascinating Spectre, where I do hope to be there as one of the liverymen of my company, the Worshipful Company World Traders, which is the first millennial company. I mean, we really are Aravists compared to a lot of these companies, where we're going to elect the Lord Mayor. But some might say electing the Lord Mayor is a little bit like deciding on who's going to run North Korea.
Well, I hope we're a wee bit more democratic than that. Yeah, and also, actually, I mean, when you think about the city, our values base is what's enabled us to prosper. We talked about security earlier, but people in the city, I mean, if you look back to the Industrial Revolution and the coffee shop conversations which led to the insurance sector, I mean, there's generally been a sense, in fact, I would wish there was more of that legacy still with us, but there's generally been a sense of engagement with the rest of the world and looking for opportunity, and yeah, I think through that contributing to the global economy.
Yes, and I mean, I think I'm being slightly facetious here, but I mean, the point is that essentially a great candidate is chosen, and then all of the different liverymen turn up, and we will effectively all nod through the appointment that's given to us, because I think it's got a good 600 years since somebody tried to vote against the chosen Lord Mayor, which is a fairly epic moment.
Yeah, although we do have some strange quirks if you go back in history. I mean, we have something when the Lord Mayor is sort of formally accepting their office. There's something called the silent ceremony, and that is silent because way back in the midst of history, there were livery companies contending for that role and people sort of causing disruption within that ceremony. So it's silent because they don't want any disruption in the room. And it's a bit arcane, but the expression in English of being at sixes and sevens, where people aren't really aligned. Well, that's because the skinners and the merchant tailors used to contend, sometimes with fisticuffs, for the right of precedence between number 6 and number 7, and it's been settled by rotating that. So now we have clubbability, we have process that is dignified, but it's really overlaid a lot of competition for that office in the past, much more vigorous than they have in North Korea.
Yes, indeed. Certainly much more vigorous competition. And in fact, I think one of the most enlightening things is that as soon as you're elevated to being a liveryman of your company, you then get a note from your clerk of your company saying, and you will be eligible to vote for the Lord Mayor in 18 months' time, because you're not allowed to vote in the first year you're clothed, because, of course, in the past, people would elevate lots of people to the livery from their company in order to try and stuff the ballot box. So there's a lot of process, which is very, very well organized in the city, thanks to that tradition, which is quite magnificent. So explain to us, I mean, a little bit about what goes on when you're doing your council function within the City of London.
Well, I mean, we've got kind of 3 levels of engagement. There's casework. So, in the ward I represent, if people have concerns about antisocial behavior, safety of a bridge, rubbish on the streets, they'll bring those sorts of concerns to me and my colleagues. So that's the casework piece, which is good local representation. We serve on committees, and it's those committees that govern the square mile in terms of what we do formally as a local authority. So I chair the Barbican Residential Committee because we essentially are the landlords of the Barbican, but I sit on Culture, Heritage and Libraries, Finance Committee, and those committees do what you would imagine they would do. And then the City of London is a wee bit odd because we're much more than a local authority. Those responsibilities I've just touched on are the local authority ones, but we own 5 bridges across the Thames. We've got a major charity fund which gives, I think, approaching 20 million a year to charity, and these are legacies of our own fund base that have built up over, you talked about 750 for the sheriffs. We've built up over 1,000 years of reserves, and we are a wealthy corporation, and we use that wealth to good end. So we've got the charitable activities, and we also have some conventional responsibilities. So conventionally, the Lord Mayor, who I trust will be Michael Manelli in a few days' time, or a few weeks' time, represents UK financial services with the dignity of a government minister when they travel abroad. And that is a conventional responsibility, but of course it's a vital one for the UK economy, given what financial services contributes to UK GDP. So, we're an odd beast, and we do the casework, we do the committee work, and we're really the cause work. That's what I would call that. Even if the cause is prosperity or if it's charity, we deliver that.
Yes, it's incredible. I mean, the City of London ends up being, in many ways, I think of it as being the ultimate exercise in soft power, because it's not really responsible to Westminster. It's not engaging with the British government per se, but yet it's incredibly intertwined, because within that square mile, well, you have the leading law courts, you have, as you say, 5 bridges that stretch. And indeed, once you set foot on the bridge from the South End, you're actually in the City of London's territory and being policed by the City of London Police Force, its own police, etc., which is quite an incredible legacy, and why it does actually feel rather like, in that case, something like Vatican City, because it's almost its own country within a country, but not quite.
Yeah, exactly. And we, conventionally, the Lord Mayor has great dignity within the state. And when state visitors come to the UK, traditionally they're entertained by the monarch one evening for a small dinner, and they come to us for a state banquet the following evening, which is a little larger. and we entertain some of the people who travel with them. And yeah, again, that's a service to the state, which goes back decades or centuries.
And is absolutely the most sensational piece of pageantry for anybody who's been lucky enough to go to a dinner in the Mansion House, where the dress standard, I'm delighted to say in this age of dress down, has still not varied below white tie, not even a tuxedo, full-on tails, which I think is absolutely magnificent in this day and age. And in fact, there's nothing more fun than going to the election of the sheriff in your morning suit, which is quite funny. Although I have to report at this point in time that when I went to the election of the sheriff for in my morning suit, when it was Michael being elected, Michael Manelli, who was a guest on this show actually a couple of years ago, ladies and gentlemen, it was hilarious because I walked out of my hotel in a morning suit, at which point in time a tourist, an American tourist, bewildered with a map, saw me and thought I was obviously one of the porters and started working towards me, which was great to see in slow motion, according to me, but actually happening very fast, was one of the actual porters in morning suit running towards this woman to try and stop her assailing a guest, which I thought was hilarious.
But I'm sure you'd have given them good directions.
I would have endeavored to give them perfectly reasonable directions, absolutely, without any problem whatsoever. But it was just extremely funny seeing this guy coming out and realizing I was obviously going to some sort of a fascinating affair of state in London that morning and was not about to primarily do his job. He was pretty worried I was going to get a tip. I suppose that's probably the thing. So tell me, Mark, how does this intertwine then with your day job? What are you getting up to there?
Yeah, well, my day job is I run a small consultancy, and we do two things: headhunting mainly finance directors for private ownership teams when they really need a new FD or a CFO for a portfolio company. Either it's a wee bit troubled or it's got great prospects and they want to bring somebody in. And then we do connectivity pieces of work, which are really either helping a firm address a question or socialize an ambition. So on the first side, a project, for example, with an American fintech that wanted to know how the Woolard review into consumer credit was going to affect their business. And broadly speaking, did they want to ramp up in the UK, remain steady, or draw down? So that was a project in which we put them in touch with experts. We washed up and left them to decide what they were going to do. I'm doing a piece of work at the moment for the UK Accelerator on space technology, which is helping them with their wonderful ambition. And ultimately, really, their ambition is to position the UK as the global hub for financing economic activity in space. And I think that would be wonderful both for the City of London and for the UK economy, and frankly be good for the world, because space shouldn't be the preserve of billionaires and dictators. Back to your North Korea point, it should be helped, supported through public channels of finance, and frankly the benefit should spread to mankind through the returns the city can deliver.
So that's a very interesting project, because I mean, in every possible sense, space is huge, reasonably infinite, and therefore commercializing it is an enormous possibility. But I suppose in another way, for the City of London, well, it's been here before.
Well, absolutely. No, I mean, my client for the space satellite applications catapult talks about space as the new economic frontier. And if you look back several hundred years, the Mayflower voyages were financed through the City of London. It was merchant venturers who pulled their money together to help the Mayflower sail. We often think of the Mayflower Puritans and we think of them in religious terms, but there was a legal structure, there was a financial premise to their voyage, and over time, it took them a while to deliver a profit, but they did deliver a profit, of course. So frankly, the city has been absolutely instrumental in voyages of endeavour in the past, and it has profited from that.
Yes, voyages of endeavour. That's a great description, actually, because you're quite right. I mean, the Pilgrim Fathers, a very spooky trip. I mean, they set sail from Boston and managed to land in Boston. That was quite incredible. I don't know how they did that, but so that's an old Eddie Izzard joke. Actually, I'm borrowing the whole process. I mean, actually, the City of London really came alive in financing terms because of that. I mean, that's the origins of our modern day Lloyd's Insurance. It's the origins of the stock markets and so on. Well, I mean, when you get a picture like this, how do you actually sit down and where do you know where to start in the whole process of commercializing space?
Well, I mean, it's a vast ambition and it's rich with potential. But broadly speaking, I think, if you consider, I'm mid-50s, people like me grew up with the dream of space. And then there were the issues in the 90s with the Challenger disaster and others, and opportunities on Earth. And I think to some extent space was squeezed for a while, and the geopolitical aspects. Tim Marshall, for example, the author of Power of Geography and Future of Geography, is really profound on the kind of the geopolitical framing for space, and it's a great book for a layman like me. But that became the kind of the dominant theme, and it was really with Elon Musk bringing down the cost of space launch that it became more of a possibility for people to really finance much more economic activity in space. I mean, I'm not sure of the precise stats, but I think if you go back to 2010, there was something like 70 satellite launches, and I think last year there was something like close to 200. So in that space of 13 years, there's been much more launch of material into orbit. And with that come all the economic possibilities.
Yes, it's quite incredible. I mean, I was sitting here barely 50 miles away over my shoulder to where the first American orbital vehicle actually landed. And you think about how we've progressed in the course of that 60 years. It's amazing. Sorry, carry on, Mark.
Well, exactly. No, we wouldn't be having this podcast if it wasn't for satellite technology. People wouldn't be driving around the country easily if it wasn't for satellite technology. I mean, right down to sort of, I think memory foam is an invention that came from space. But the next generation of possibility is going to be going much further. So essentially, there are wonderful ambitions, and the UK has leading universities. It has great skills. There's protection of IP here, and there are ideas about space solar energy that could really change the fate of mankind. There's micro-G pharmaceuticals manufacture, of course. All the data possibilities, all the climate mapping that can come on from satellite technology is profound. And then when you think about even the city's position, I think the data that's held in space that's used by the city is really helps us function in financial markets.
And that raises the fascinating issue, actually, because what is the City of London's advantage here? Is it geography, which obviously it's not quite in the epicenter of space? Is it the legal system? What are the key facets that make Britain very advantageous? Because while you say it's a great researcher in space and so on, it's obviously not the leading space nation. We know where that is. But what is its advantage?
Well, I mean, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese are way ahead. The North Koreans actually, I think, put up 22 satellites last year. I need to take some of my stats with a pinch of salt, but what the UK has is what we have in this community, which is capital, expertise to structure. And, frankly, if the city gets this right, we will ensure that space isn't the preserve of dictators and billionaires, but that it really is open to the whole of mankind. Because, when you think about the mining possibilities in space and you think about the treaty frameworks, how much are you aware of the kind of the treaties which govern space activity?
Oh, I think that's a great place to go, actually. But I'm going to stop you right now because we've got a question has just arrived from Mary, which I think is actually in the middle of your train of thought, because you say, Mark, that space must be more than just for nations and plutocrats. Yeah. How can the city help democratize the commercial opportunities of space?
Well, okay, absolutely. So now if you look at the treaties, now again, caveat that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not deep in these areas, but the first treaty to govern activity in space was, I think, the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. And that arose from the danger of nuclear weaponry in space. And it was kind of a defensive position, broadly speaking, accepted. So most nations, those big three that I talked about earlier, and most across the planet have signed up to that. But there are some ambiguities in it. So it doesn't define, for example, peaceful activity, and it is really focused on state actors. So your point, Mary, about plutocrats, frankly, there is nothing in that treaty, as far as I'm aware, that governs the actions of individuals in space. So, that's got gaps. By 1979, the Moon Treaty was drawn together. And that is, well, really, I think, being led by the United Nations. But it hasn't got much support yet. So I mean, the big three they haven't signed. Most nations haven't ratified the treaty and haven't brought it into law. So that does try and address some of these anomalies, and it does try to go further on the economic activity in space. Mining, for example, is one of the great potentials. So, we're looking at kind of a situation in which the treaties need to be tightened. We're also looking at a situation in which Elon Musk and others have ensured that we can get more sort of kit up into space. And what the UK can do is severalfold. So we've recently released something called the Astra Charter. And it sounds a little bit bold and conceptual and aspirational, but it's, I'll quote it. It says, its strapline is to care for the infinite wonders of the universe. And that's not just a hippie ambition. It's really trying to create a conceptual framework for how people act in the economy of space to ensure that it's sustainable and yet that it delivers a prosperous and peaceful economy. And that's got the support of our king. It's got the support of a wide community in the UK. We also have, in governmental terms, something called the National Space Strategy in Action, which I think there was a space strategy in action in 21. There's one that came out in July this year. And that's talking about how essentially we can build a community of expertise in the UK, both the technologists and the financial services community, to ensure that people can invest in space, quite literally invest in space, and draw the profit from it. Now, this is a hope on my side, but I believe that once there is a really broad base of people with an interest in space and a governance frame through the sharpening of the treaties, you will find that economic activity tends to be peaceful. I think if you leave space to the state actors and the billionaires, there won't be sufficient in, I suppose, the rewards of space, other than what the crumbs that humanity will take from it, to mean that there is a really solid, peaceful, and engaged international community. I might be slightly wordy on that, but what I'm driving at is, if people can actually have a stake in what's happening in space, and I think the best place to have them get that stake is the City of London, then they will be more interested in ensuring peaceful development rather than simply sort of lasers going up there to knock down other people's kit.
And that actually brings us very elegantly back then to, I think, the huge advantage of the City of London, which is essentially as a home, an epicentre for common law. If you want to understand that better, ladies and gentlemen, go back to the IPO-VID with Barnabas Reynolds, who's a really leading superbrain lawyer in the City of London, probably the best advocate for common law in the world. And he's written common law systems for other nations in the world, such as Abu Dhabi, etc., etc. And in that respect, it becomes a huge opportunity. And that actually brings us to a fabulous question here from Ashutosh Shastri. Thank you very much. I think this is the first time, Ashutosh, you've engaged with the program. It's great to see you. Thank you for your question. The UK has the opportunity to create the commercial architecture, including partnerships. How will the city help to build this architecture? Space financing. Yeah. I see a huge opportunity for the UK-India partnership in space.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when Mary asked her question, I should have be mindful of what we're actually doing. So to give you a little bit of sense of, I talked about the Astra Charter, I talked about National Space Strategy in Action. What we are doing with our community is we held a roundtable at the end of May. That brought together people with expertise in various areas: insurance, legal services, investment management, VC. The UK has got great investors, Seraphim are in this area. We've got great financiers, so there's New Space Finance in Action as well. But what we needed to do is get a community of people talking across their areas of expertise. So lawyers talking with insurers, talking with investors, talking with VC people. Government was in the room. We had parliamentary representation. And we've taken that roundtable, which was really an introductory conversation, into working groups. Now, those groups are convened by experts in their area. And we do have a group that's looking at international engagement, chaired by somebody with eminent credentials. She's got, I think it's about 12 people working with her, including overseas embassies and UK actors in defence and in diplomacy. And they are drawing together ideas that will be essentially one-pagers. So we've got, I think, 8 working groups. We'll have 8 one-pagers. They will be ready in October. And we will then take those to the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology to lay before them, broadly speaking, quite a loose framework, but for what the city what the city perceives as the issues to engage with space and what we perceive as the opportunities, and a few ideas on how we feel we can encourage, I suppose, growth of UK financial services in space. I mean, if you look at Spain, for example, I think they've got about 1/4 of the GDP of the UK, and yet they invest 8 times as much in space. So, the UK is lagging in what it could be doing, especially given that we've got the City of London as a major resource.
That's fascinating. So both as a conduit and actually a source of capital as well, something to think about. Thank you very much, Ashutosh Shastri. I really appreciate your call. And also, I think huge congratulations to India on that magnificent landing on the dark side of the moon, which was a highlight of the G20 meeting. So let me actually just break away for a moment, because I'm going to give you a quick rest because we're about halfway through. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, to look at the finance book of the week this week. I must admit, I'm quite surprised by this week's choice because it's been chosen by my team without any input from me. And it was the original EI 1000, the Exchange Invest Index of the world's most influential people in market structure. We published that 6 years ago this week. It was full of actually more than 1,000 people. There were about 1,100 people mentioned in the whole tome. Some of them were people who had unfortunately passed away. Some of them had retired. Others were people who were potentially going to be in the list. And it includes a series of sub-lists containing various categories like regional leaders, women, experts in all manners of different types of markets, deal makers, visionaries, those who were in the embryonic, as it was at that stage 6 years ago, world of blockchain, fintech, and more. You can still buy that book online. And don't forget, our next book of the week will be unveiled on Saturday in the EI Exchange Invest Weekend Edition, which you can read free if you go to exchangeinvest.com and sign up there. But don't forget, if you want the skinny on the inside, the water cooler of the Bourse business, as it were, the exchange of information, then don't forget to sign up for your subscription at only $349 per user year with a 30-day free trial to Exchange Invest, the daily bulletin of Bourse business news, which tomorrow, of course, will have a great deal of insights into the demise as CEO of the World Federation of Exchanges president, or indeed chairman, sorry, I should say, to be absolutely correct, Ed Tilly, who has been pushed out of office today. So, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we return to Mark Wheatley, who's talking from the city to space. Very interesting. Sorry, Mark, I want to take you back just a few minutes. I'm afraid this is a bit of a brain teaser, but you mentioned very, very rapidly a book which you said was a great guide to the sort of start of space. Could you run that past us again, please?
Yeah. There's a guy called Tim Marshall, and he wrote Prisoners of Geography a few years ago, which was talking about how states have been shaped by their geographic position. He then wrote Power of Geography, which is looking at kind of the moment at the time that he wrote a few years ago. So, where does the UK go post-Brexit, given its geographical position? What's going on in the Sahel? His final chapter is on space in that book, and he looks at some of the kind of the geopolitical issues that essentially people contend with when they look at space. And his next book is The Future of Geography, and that is all going to be all about space. And it's already been published. I think it came out earlier this year. I just haven't read it yet, and I'm going to be beetling away to get a copy.
Fascinating. Really, really interesting. So a cadre of 3 books by Tim Marshall there we can look up. That's really good. Thank you very much, Mary, for your question. Thank you once again, Ashutosh Shastri, for your question. Great to see you both engaging with the show. So, Mark, there's a huge opportunity out there. You've got a series of committees, subcommittees who are looking towards getting in here. I'm not trying to get at what the results are going to be, but what sort of a timeline are we likely to see in the development of this process?
Well, it is going to take years. So essentially, we're looking at a 60-month program to really get to what the final outcomes will be, or indeed what the outcomes will be at that point in time. But essentially, this community is bringing forward its ideas, and that will be, opportunity focused rather than risk obsessed. What can the UK be doing to strengthen its position? In economic terms, space employs about 40,000 people in the UK, delivers about 18 billion to the UK economy. But if we get the financial services community here right, we will be servicing space activity around the world, whether it's in Chile, the UAE, or elsewhere. And therefore, there'll be a great economic benefit. But 6 months on, when we hit December from where we started, we will have ideas to take to the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. They are refining their policies and their strategies, and hopefully our document will feed into that. But if we're looking at content, we're also building a community. And at the moment in the City of London, there's a lot of people who are either just curious about space or not particularly interested in it because they've been focused on other areas. And frankly, if you look at what's going on generally, technology companies have struggled to thrive, list and grow in the UK. They've gone to the States often. So there's a major initiative in Square Mile to ensure, I think, Mansion House Compact, that we can unlock, we hope to unlock some DC money into tech companies so they can sort of scale up and grow. And some of the issues we face in space are therefore issues that life sciences companies face, that fintech companies face. So we're trying to sort of engage with other people who are facing the same questions and same challenges at the same time as refining our own ideas about this particular community. So it's, there's a lot to deal with in that, and there's a lot to unpack, and hopefully there's, a great reward. But, it's going to take time. We're going to build the community up, and we're going to sharpen our content as we go.
Gosh, it sounds like such an incredibly exciting agenda from start to finish. And there's just so many different ways in which it can go. And of course, we have had some ventures in and around the city that have already taken place. There was the London Satellite Exchange, which was operating 20 odd years ago, which I think ended up, in fact, being sucked back under the womb of its major shareholder, Airbus. So it ended up back in, I think, Toulouse was the place it was last seen, because that's the Airbus headquarters. But obviously, when you start looking at this, it must be incredibly difficult working out how you actually start to prioritize, because there are so many possibilities and opportunities.
Well, you can kind of overthink to some degree. We mentioned the voyagers before, those lucky people who left Boston and ended up in Boston. Well, they were setting out for Virginia, of course, and they landed in the wrong place. There were 102 of them. They faced adversity, but they traveled in hope and with the quality of hard work, like most migrants do. And so what they took with them in terms of their raw ability is what I hope still remains in the city. Much as I love this community, we do, over the last, I'd say, probably 20 or so years, have a strong risk focus. And I don't think we've often perceived the opportunity. But I mean, the economy of space by 2040 is supposed to be delivering about $1 trillion to the global economy. We in the City of London should be looking to grab that with both hands. We should be looking to ensure that we can develop a really robust and rich community here. I mean, at the moment, insurers are well positioned. They've been insuring satellite launches for decades. But many other communities just don't have a strong base. I highlighted Seraphim earlier, and New Space Finance. Those are great people, but why aren't there more VCs? Why aren't institutional investors not necessarily categorizing space as an asset class, but showing more interest? The reason is, frankly, these are long-term propositions that some of them are going to take 10 years to deliver a profit. The data ones will be much quicker. Those looking at ESG and climate mapping will be much quicker. But some of these need a long-term commitment, and has given that yet, to ensure that there is a ladder for growth and a confidence for them. But if a bit more heft from the government, a little bit more opportunism in the city, and we'll get there.
Fascinating, and a very, very good point that you make. Yes, I mean, Lloyd's of London, which in many ways, I mean, has the funkiest, still most contemporary building in the entire City of London, designed by Richard Rogers, with its sort of insides on the outside, but nonetheless also happens to be one of the most strongly paper-driven franchises, which I think has struggled to really get itself up to muster with technology, and indeed with digitalizing what goes on. And yet, as you say, there it is. It's in the epicenter of ensuring hundreds of satellite launches every year, and I think is the biggest source of satellite launch insurance on the planet, which is absolutely incredible. And that statistic is mind-boggling. I mean, the space economy will be delivering $1 trillion by 2040, and it's obvious that the City of London, if the City of London can be funding even 25% of that, that's a huge amount of essentially assets under management for the square mile.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you look at asteroids and other space bodies, and nickel, cobalt, titanium, the minerals that are up there, space solar energy has rich potential, because essentially you can put up, so I understand, solar panels roughly the size of a dinner table. You assemble them in space, and once that kit is up there, it's got a good long lifespan, and it's beaming solar energy down to Earth. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's sustainable, it's rich in every sense, and I mean, the possibilities there are immense. And once city financiers get behind that properly, and once we plug into our international community, Ash talked about India, but the States is a great place to look, but also some of the emerging space powers and others. I mentioned Chile earlier and UAE. Frankly, some of those are ahead of us in what they're actually doing in launch. I think the UK had 1 attempted launch last year. Yemen had 5. Successful launches.
The incredible thing is Yemen had 5, despite being in the middle of really the embers of a civil war, which has not managed to happen in the UK recently. That's an incredible statistic in terms of launches and what's going on. I think the other thing that's amazing is you talk about the likes of the possibility for satellite energy and solar power and so on. There's also this whole area of the hydroponics movement, which are looking to move into space, which I think can revolutionize a lot of the ability to grow very high quality fresh produce, to the point where in perhaps 10 or 20 years, your Ocado van may actually be dropping in from outer space to deliver your greens. I mean, the possibilities are almost endless.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We're almost into that sort of wonderful world of science fiction. And, you know, it is remarkable what lies out there, what the potential is.
Yes, absolutely. The one big class action suit that's still to come is we should all be suing the world for not delivering in our adulthood what they promised us in our childhood for science fiction. Although I suppose on the other hand, they might say, well, they didn't also deliver us all those people who were invading the Earth, which is one of those problems. And actually, that brings me to a sort of an analogy, because one of the great science fiction shows when I was a kid, and maybe you remember, it was a thing, I think it was called UFO, and it was famously based around this UK-based organization, Shadow, who were defending the world, and they were being attacked from outer space and so on. And it's the most incredible, advanced sci-fi, amazing. They had actually hydrogen-powered cars, which are just about coming on stream, I see, etc., etc. Ed Straker is the amazingly coiffed boss wearing, I don't know, PVC plastic or something. What always amused me about that, though, was the way that people hadn't thought things through in anything other than a linear fashion. So actually, Ed Straker's office, which is all super high-tech, he walks out of a super high-tech office and walks straight into a typing pool with 30 ladies, only ladies, working at typewriters, typing things, not word process, not anything. And I mean, that was 1973. Even by, I think, 1982, it looked ridiculously silly. Yeah. And I suppose the thing I have to ask you then is, how do you try and think not just on the linear progress, but laterally and out of the box, so that you don't end up building a funding typing pool for space, which obviously would be the wrong thing to do?
Well, there are very clever people thinking about what's going to be going on in the economy of space and more generally. I mean, really deep thinkers, and they'll be considering all sorts of possibilities. But, you know, broadly speaking, I would say by not getting obsessed by the detail, by keeping things reasonably loose and flexible. So, you know, we talked about insurance. That's a community that, you know, grew up ensuring, you know, the loss of ships, yet it works perfectly well for satellites. So begin, you know, like you mentioned Barney Reynolds and common law. Begin by keeping things pretty easy. Yeah, don't try to overdefine the regulations. I would say anyway. I think there'll be other people with different views, but work on a principles base, on a values base that's kind of flexible and adaptable, and, you know, make sure that basically people can identify opportunity, invest in it, and have a stake in the outcomes, and things will work out. But, you know, whether it's typing pools in space or, you know, something else, I don't know.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant point you make, because actually when you look at the success of the City of London, it has been by applying rules, peer group pressure, organisation through history, yet at the same time keeping things incredibly simple. Meum dictum, meum pactum est, my word is my bond. It served the London Stock Exchange spectacularly well for 500 years, and I'm not entirely sure that pro rata, the thousands of pages of rule books that have come down from the gods or the European Union or the FCA or whatever, have proportionately done as well as just a little simple Latin phrase did 500, 600 years ago. It's a very, very good point.
Well, because I mean, essentially, I believe your values your interests arise from your values rather than the other way around. And if you try to sort of define every risk you face and address it in tight terms, well, you'll just, frankly, you'll gum everything up. And just, yeah, broadly speaking, I think to some extent we've moved in that direction socially.
Yes, and I think that's one area where it's definitely very difficult to apply the precautionary principle and then say, let's apply that to space, because if you did that, then you'd basically decide to stay at home, at which point in time you'd amount to the fact that, 40% or 60% of all accidents happen domestically, so therefore you should have left. So you end up in this incredible cycle of delusion. Okay, so I mean, we're coming towards the end of what has been an absolutely gripping show. You've outlined the possibilities for the space economy so well. you're in what, month 60 of a 60-month process, Mark. So there's obviously a long way to go. We'd really like to hear from you again. We'd love you to come back when you've got some, not necessarily interesting news, but you can talk to us more about the dynamics, whether that's in a year's time, 2 years' time, or whatever, because it's going to be a fascinating long-term process. And I think, certainly speaking on behalf of Exchange Invest, we're all behind you in terms of finding ways that we can manage to revitalize this whole exciting market and give it something that actually should be, I think, an epicenter of the exchange world as well. But as you look out on this, and as you look on your life and the interests of what you're doing and so on, Mark Wheatley, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, of course, I'm going to say up. It's space. But I mean, that's not just kind of a glib. Well, I mean, it is a glib statement, but it's not just a glib statement. If we talked about the Lord Mayor earlier. If you look in Guildhall Yard, the Aldermanic Court, we talked about the Court of Aldermen and the people from whom the Lord Mayor is drawn, is essentially a concrete wood-panelled landing module. That was built in the 1950s. So our forebears in the City of London were fascinated by what space could represent. We in the City of London right now should be, I believe we will be, and that's why I believe we'll prosper by going up.
The only way is up. I'm sure if I could manage to sing better, I could offer some words from Yaz and the Plastic Population there, amongst others, popular young persons beat combos. That would certainly be something to probably deafen you. So I won't bother singing it, but at the same time, it's a great message on which to end. The only way is up. There is an infinite possibility out there. And certainly I do agree that this is a world of opportunity. And now we have a galaxy or galaxies of opportunity around us, which should propel the City of London forward in the world of finance. That becomes a really, really fascinating opportunity. I want to say a huge word of thanks to Mark Wheatley for being an absolutely terrific guest today. I want to thank all those who've intervened. Thank you, Marcus Ward, all the way in Grimsby. I'm not sure what Grimsby Space Project is like, but I'm sure you'll tell us by DM in the due course, Marcus. John T, thank you very, very much for joining us as well. Excellent questions this evening. We only had two, but they were magnificent quality altogether. Mary really, really appreciated your concerns about national interests and plutocrats and the opportunities for all of us, the great unwashed hoi polloi when it comes to investing in space. And then we have Ashutosh Shastri. That was an absolutely magnificent question, well thought out and a very, very interesting one, particularly investigating the nexus between the opportunities there are for the City of London and indeed the world's most populous nation and a huge growth factor in the world economy on Earth. Let's see what they can manage to do in space. It's going to be incredible, particularly on the Anglo-Indian axis. And let me also say thank you very, very much to Ian Miller. Great to see you, Ian, this evening. Thank you both. Very interesting program. I agree. This has been a fascinating show today. Most enjoyable altogether. I want to thank once again our excellent guest, Mark. I wish you all the very, very best with everything in the City of London. As always, it's a great place to be, a dynamic financial centre, and we wish you, Mark Wheatley, and everyone within it all the success. And of course, we are delighted to be looking forward to basically swearing our loyalty towards the incoming Lord Mayor. Let's hope that, well, it could be a cliffhanger. Who knows when the election takes place on Friday week for Alderman Professor Michael Minnelli. Going to be an absolutely epic year, I think, for the City of London. Quite magnificent, building on the last two very, very strong Lord Mayors we have had, despite COVID and all sorts of other issues that affected their terms. So next week, ladies and gentlemen, we've got another magnificent. We're staying on Earth, although actually a lot of the precepts that are going to be in here could be applied to space as well in due course. Andreas Schweitzer, he is an expert in the field. He's going to be talking to us about trade finance as an asset class. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to seeing you same time at same place next week. Thank you once again to our magnificent guest today, Mark Wheatley, coming from the city and going all the way into space. And of course, what can we say? Well, the opportunity, of course, as we know, it's all about hope and prosperity, which are very neatly proximate to the home that you share with all of your wonderful family. All the very, very best to them. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick L. Young. See you again, same place, same time next week. I wish you all a fantastic week, whatever financial centre you're in. And of course, that week is great in life and markets.